Welcome to First Class Fantasy. I'm Theo Gremminger, joined as always by Billy Muzio. Billy, we're back at it. We missed some weeks away. Last week we crushed it. We're back here today, and we're actually have a really fun show. We're going to talk a little bit of Bounceback Candidates, and this was a fun one. Me and you actually went back and forth and had a pretty significant arguments trying to determine who our top 5 Bounceback candidates are. And I think it's interesting because this time of year, you see people who are like angry drafting, and they keep this like memory in the back of their heads where I'm never drafting that guy again. That year I drafted that guy and he crushed my season. Do you see this like where the guy misses ADP and it messes people's process up the next year?
Oh, yeah, and I think the easy one, and we'll get to the name later, is somebody like Kyle Pitts. Like, how many times have people selected him as a tight end 1 and top 5 or top 4 even, and he's let them down, but things change, players change, systems change, coaches change, and the landscape of that position changes, and next thing you know, you have burnt the bridge per se of never going back to the well, or, you refuse to draft him, and you get emotional about it. And next thing you know, this player is, the tight end 1 or the wide receiver 1 or the quarterback 1. So we preach all the time inside of First Class Fantasy that you need to remove your emotions from the equation when it comes to fantasy sports. And you need to treat it like a business. And you need to look at it as a new opportunity or a new endeavor. And you need to be able to wipe the previous slate clean and look at it as a new perspective and a new season and attack it at that approach. And otherwise, you're going to miss the chances of drafting people who could have career years based upon some assumptions from the past.
Yeah, and I think that there's been so many lessons with this. Like, the first thing you want to do whenever possible, and there's some guys who we would say are not the greatest talents, but end up in the great situations, getting a lot of volume's king and all that. But when it comes down to it, when you bet on a player and their talent, and things certainly don't go as planned, it doesn't mean that door is closed for the following season. Things change. Quality of the offense changes. Quarterback play can change. Offensive coordinators can change. A lot of factors can go into how a player does in fantasy. But I think the greatest kind of recent example of this is Saquon Barkley. If you drafted Saquon Barkley in 2020, you got 2 games out of Saquon. The following season, he gave you 13 games, and he finished as running back 27 in points per game. If you would have said, I'm never gonna draft Saquon again, then this would have kept you away from running back 5 overall in 2022, and then last year follows it up with running back 9. Certainly a more of a positive season in 2022 where I think like the win rates were better, but it just goes to show you like these players don't disappear. The situations can change. Is there, the Saquon one, is that one that like a good example of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great example. And he's in a new situation. Eagles are going to be consistently in the red zone, always going to be a chance to score. I mean, yes, he has to worry about, the quarterback and the tush push, but this is an RPO system, and it's going to open up a lot of opportunities for Saquon. And he's arguably going to have the best offensive line that he's had in his entire career. And so there's a lot of, if you would just shut it out and say, I'm never drafting Saquon again, then look at what you could be missing out.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just sort of like, I like what you said about taking emotion out of the game. And another thing that we've talked about is don't hate the player, hate the ADP. Like when we're looking at even players we like, Billy, we've got to be able to say, I really like that player, but this player costs way too much and they're probably not going to be part of my draft plan. I think that's one thing where people always sort of have like the rose-colored glasses where they'll look and see like the best possible scenario. I think one thing that you do very well is you try to look at like the low-end projection and the high-end projection and sort of play like the range of outcome games. But I think that like every year you'll see these guys kind of steamed up where they'll sort of reach a point where you're drafting them at their absolute peak.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The range of outcomes is just the business perspective. It's my business mind that I look at things. I always look at business as a worst case scenario and best case scenario. And I do the same with players and ADP, right? We need to look at it. Hey, what is the absolute ceiling here? And what is the absolute floor? And usually it's somewhere in between. And, we may get lucky and get the ceiling play out of a lot of these players. But if we can identify that ceiling and floor and then settle in between somewhere and then figure out if you're going to be closer to the ceiling or close to the floor, it really helps us find the values of the board.
One thing that not on the show sheet, but when I'm thinking about the process, a lot of times we talk about recency bias where people will put a little too much stock into what somebody did in the playoffs. But if we can kind of remove that, do you put more, like in your process for looking at targets and which players to fade, are you looking at what they kind of did as a whole last year? Or are you more interested in what they did in the second half of the season? Or is it more of a kind of combined?
It's more combined, but I think there's another part of that equation. It's also about what was happening with the team. Were they in a playoff hunt? Were they not in a playoff hunt? Were other players injured? Have they added new weapons this year? Like there's so many different equations to that. I think to your question, that you can't look at it just in those two parts. It's black or white. There's a lot more gray here. Because if they had an outstanding, rush down the end of the stretch, maybe the wide receiver 2 was hurt and they were the de facto wide receiver 1 or vice versa, and maybe, the RB2 was hurt and they had the entire backfield to themselves. And so I don't want to get too caught up in just the numbers of down the stretch or what they did in just the beginning of the year, because there's so much that changes and evolves in an NFL season. And then during the offseason, you have offensive coach, you have, OC changes, you have head coach changes, you have the draft. And so we need to look at it. You could take all that information. Don't get me wrong. It's still going to be part of the equation, but it has to be just a piece of the equation. You can't just say, man, he was so good down the stretch that momentum's going to carry over, because it might not. Especially if they went out and drafted a wide receiver 1. Now there's all this target competition. Or maybe the new OC likes to target the slot receiver and he's running out wide. And so there's so many different pieces that we have to look at when a team makes changes that's really going to affect the player's ADP and the overall output this player is going to have in the statistics.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting way of looking at it. One other question I have for you, Billy, is we have OTAs going on. You're getting all these media reports. Is there anything in particular do you find that it's best to kind of sift through it and kind of pay very, very close attention? Or do you think that we can kind of get a little too influenced by, guys playing in shorts and the sort of the hype we get from the constant drip? Because I know, like, even if we go back 5-10 years as players, there wasn't quite as much like information dropping. Now it's like constant. Every little thing that happens at any single OTA, any single mini camp is going to come out and we're going to hear it, and it comes out rapidly and there's a million people responding to it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information that you need to digest through with OTAs. Like you see a receiver that makes a catch across the middle and he's sprawled out and he's got his back arched and the ball's up in the tip at the tip of his jump, and he doesn't have a linebacker there across the middle of the field that's ready to pound him in the back. Like there's a lot of things that change when it goes to game speed and when it also goes to a defender on an opposing team that's ready to drill him. And so I think you need to look at OTAs and look for pieces like camp battles, and you can see who's running with the 1s, who's running with the 2s, who took lead snaps, who's taking the passes out of the backfield, and you utilize that information. But some guy catching down across the middle of the field in shorts, like, okay, whoop-de-doo, like we can do that in Pop Warner too. But once you start adding in defenders and big hits, that shit doesn't happen as much.
Well, I still get hyped when Brock Bowers looks awesome in shorts, and they gave him a manufactured handoff. That got me a little bit hyped. So we're gonna take a quick break. We're gonna talk about bounce back guys, but before we do that, we're gonna talk about another edge that Billy and I have been sort of focusing on, especially last offseason: bad offenses. And do we want you to draft a bunch of players on bad offenses? No, but we think we can find value on some of these teams that maybe your league mates, maybe people you're doing early best balls with, are completely ignoring. We'll be right back in just a moment.
Hey, why do we partner with the FFPC? Because they have the widest variety of fantasy football formats, and it's the easiest place to find all types of fantasy football contests in the world. What if you want to play for high stakes? Well, they have a $6 million prize pool with their Fantasy Players Championship. They also have way too early best ball leagues that start in February and dynasty leagues. They have the closest thing to a liquid market for orphans that there is in all of Dynasty. And the FFPC has sponsored us for half a decade because we are actually delivering information that can help fantasy gamers, and they're generating so much interest and bringing in so many new users, casual users even. The FFPC creates a unique experience where you can both compete against the best and make money. Use promo code UNDERWORLD to get $25 off your first team. $25 off your first team at the FFPC with promo code UNDERWORLD. Go get it!
And we're back at First Class Fantasy. And Billy, last year, we sat here and we talked about some of these bad offenses. And it's sort of like, I think usually it comes from the top. An offense is bad because people don't like the quarterback, and then therefore there's sort of like a cascade effect of the weapons. Some teams, it can be a little bit different where maybe there's a quarterback that can run a little bit. It's not like a set rule, but I think generally it's the teams with bad quarterbacks, teams usually fade. And then a lot of times if there's not a clear-cut running back, then there's even more of a fade there. So I've kind of signaled about 5 teams that I think people are kind of fading right now. And can we find a little bit of value from them? And if you guys think this is a task where, hey, I have other podcasts saying target really good offenses, that's the way you should be drafting. Billy and I can talk about last year. It's really easy. Tampa Bay. Billy and I were saying draft Rachaad White. He fell to the 7th round, fell to the 6th round, ends up finishing as a top 5 running back last year. And then we continually had these conversations with pretty much every single guest on Chris Godwin or Mike Evans. And the kind of the general takeaway was take a shot on at least one of them. Now, if you took Mike Evans, you ended up with a top 6 wide receiver. You ended up with Godwin, you still had a wide receiver 3, which was right about where he was being drafted. Evans was an ADP crusher. So I think it's the hive mind. It's people kind of fading these offenses as a whole. And it's also like you get into when you click the draft button on a bad offense, you never feel great about it. Last year, we'll also bring up, the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, huge hit, an offense that people were generally fading, Billy. So what do you think that is? You think it's a general good rule to target the good offenses, or do you think it's let's find the touches, let's find the value in these bad offenses?
Well, I think people are chasing points, and they look at it and say that, Denver Broncos probably aren't going to score a lot. They look at it and say the Tennessee Titans aren't going to score a lot. Or they look at it and say the New York Giants last year finished 30th in points per game. And when you have these type of statistics, typically, of course, they're not scoring, which now you're reducing your total touchdowns as a fantasy player, which is, of course, getting the bulk of your scoring there outside of your yardage. And so it's going to just negatively impact your team if you're on one of the lower scoring offenses. So I think there's a lot of logic to it, but I do think that there is a lot of value to be had should that team outperform that ADP like the Buccaneers did last year.
Well, you mentioned Tennessee and you mentioned Denver, and that's 2 of the teams on the list. And let's talk about Tennessee first. I think Tennessee's interesting because stylistically, we're going to get the passing volume. They bring Callahan over from Cincinnati. Cincinnati, with him as offensive coordinator, continually finished inside of like the top 6 pass attempts in the league, top 8 pass attempts in the league. Now, certainly this was could it have been influenced by the fact that he had Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, players like that? Sure. But I think that was the philosophy of their team, and you're starting to see that with Tennessee. This offseason, they signed Calvin Ridley. They signed Tyler Boyd. They move on from Derrick Henry. They signed Tony Pollard, who had 50-plus receptions last year. Tyjae Spears is back. They draft J.C. Latham, kind of shoring up the offensive line concern, and they are really kind of setting everything up for Will Levis. Now, Will Levis is going off the board around quarterback 25, I believe, 24 on Underdog right now. But I without looking really at Levis, to me, it's trying to find value and sifting through wide receiver, and let's sift through running back a little bit. Do one of these wide receivers jump out at you? Right now, Calvin Ridley signed the mega deal. He's wide receiver 36. And DeAndre Hopkins, who was actually good last year, is down to wide receiver 45. Like them both? Like one?
I have never really been a Ridley fan. So I'm going to say I'm passing on Ridley. Hopkins, I jump at the ADP right now. But you can't talk about this team and not talk about Will Levis because they went around and surrounded him with talent. They retained Hopkins, like you said. They got Ridley. They got Tyler Boyd. They still have Treylon Burks. Whatever he does, we'll find out, right? Still got Chigo, who's underperformed last year, who arguably could have been on this bounce back list, I think. And like you said, Tony Pollard is just this whole new look offense. My only fear, though, is that this defense is actually very stout this year. And so we could be looking at a bunch of like 17-10 games, 13-7 games. And so this could limit the overall potential of this offense just because the defense could be so stout. We could see a bunch of 3-and-outs. That's my only fear with the offense. But if we're able to see Will Levis take a step forward and start getting the ball to his playmakers, I think that this could be an underrated offense. And I'm not saying they're going to make a leap like the Lions did, but this could easily be an offense that we saw similar to last year where like Tampa Bay was being drafted. And then all of a sudden we have a bunch of playmakers with Will Levis being able to get the ball out of his hands. The completion percentage is a bit of a concern. He's only at 58.4% last year. And so I think that if he can have more of the big games like his first game, this is an offense that we could say is going to significantly outperform ADP. Most likely, we're not going to see that level on a week-to-week basis, of course, but I do think that the range of outcomes is I think there's a lot of outs per se for the Tennessee Titans to outperform the current ADP in draft rooms.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. Levis is certainly a guy who I'd be more comfortable with as my QB2. I know Billy Muzio's drafting style is to completely punt quarterback and take one of these low-end QB2s, real sicko mode. But Levis, like we saw it in the one game, I think stylistically what they've done is they've said that they trust him because they had opportunities to take one of these other quarterbacks in this draft class and sort of re-roll it. They could have drafted a JJ McCarthy. They said, there's no chance we're doing that. Instead, they went and they leaned into the Ridleys, the Boyds. I think Ridley, I know you're not a huge fan of, but the amount of money they gave him, he's going to have an outsized role in this offense.
Look at the money they gave Russell Wilson. I don't give a shit about the money they gave him.
I like the money they gave. I'm saying Ridley last year was wide receiver 18, and he'd missed such a large portion of time before last season. So, there were some very disappointing games, but the end result was wide receiver 18 in PPR, and he certainly got paid, and you're getting him as wide receiver 36. I actually think both of these guys are appealing right now at ADP. I'd imagine as the summer moves along, one of them probably creeps up a little bit. What probably should happen is these two should start to converge a little bit together, where they're both kind of closer to the wide receiver 3 line, because I think D-Hop's right now, D-Hop's, if he plays and he's healthy next year, there's no way he's finishing wide receiver 45. He's too good a player. He's beaten that every single year. And again, his quality of play last year was solid. Wide receiver wise, we seem to both like D-Hops, and we'll argue a little on Ridley. Running back wise, you see Tajay was a guy that if they didn't sign Pollard, we would see Tajay being drafted like running back 18. We'd be all excited about him. Now he's like a running back 3 line type guy, and you're seeing Pollard at like running back 27. Do either of these two appeal to you?
Yeah, I like Pollard. I think Pollard is another name we could have put on this bounce back candidate list. Again, we're not going to see the volume that we saw with Derrick Henry, where they were number 17 last year in the league in rushing yards. But this offense is going to look a lot more balanced, which in my opinion is going to open up the box a little bit more and give Pollard a little bit of room to breathe per se from the backfield. So I really like Pollard in this offense. Again, we have a quarterback who is underexperienced, I would say. And he could utilize Pollard as an outlet as well. So I've been drafting Pollard wherever I can.
Yeah, I think Pollard, Tajay's a little bit more of a contingent play, and I think it's disappointing. But I think with the way that the offense is looking, those wide receivers are going to be utilized in the passing game every single week. I think Pollard's the one they're going to lean on. Tajay is going to be more of a change of pace, maybe some third down back roll. But the problem being with Tajay's such a good receiver, and Pollard caps that. Pollard's a very good receiver. That's one thing that, 50 receptions last year. I think you would probably bet on him getting around the same amount of receptions this year. I think he's either be neutral on or target at that the high end running back 3 range. Whereas Tajay, he might be steamed up a little bit higher than he can produce unless there's a Pollard injury. Let's pivot over to a team that's not so appealing. Billy, it seems like we had this conversation last year where the only New England Patriot that was being drafted at all was Ramondre Stevenson. And Ramondre last year steamed way, way up. Now Ramondre Stevenson is the highest selected New England Patriot skill position player. And Billy, his ADP right now, 78 overall on Underdog. He's going off the board as running back 20. This is a completely ignored and forgotten team. Antonio Gibson signed as a free agent. Antonio Gibson had a career high in catches last year, kind of quietly. Certainly his rushing opportunities fell way off, but he caught the ball and they targeted him in free agency. Where are you at on Mondre? Because Mondre was a guy that we both liked this time last year. And he was sort of mixed results, a little bit of a disappointment. And then down the stretch, Zeke got that work in those games that could have been Ramondre games.
Yeah, I actually like both running backs this year just because, again, we have the inexperienced quarterback, probably going to lean in the rushing game a little bit more, maybe look at some hard-nosed football. And again, they just lack some of the weapons that is necessary into the passing game to be successful through the air. Demario Douglas, although he had some spots last year where he succeeded, not someone I necessarily want to hang my hat on, right? Kendrick Bourne, who I like more than most people do, is not coming out here like a Brandon Ayuk who someone's going to command targets, right? And then you have from there Hunter Henry, and probably is going to be one of the better options at the passing game at this point. So I think we look at potentially a lot of 12 personnel, which is also good for the running backs. So Stevenson, Antonio Gibson were both on my draft lists. I'm kind of fading a lot of the wide receivers, but the one I do like, kind of dark horse name on this offense that I think could emerge as like the wide receiver 2 or 3 that no one's really talking about is KJ Osborne.
KJ Osborne, I think that's an interesting one. Another guy that they brought in free agency. We saw him have some very big games in Minnesota. Certainly never the consistency with guys like Justin Jefferson, Thielen, Addison, Hawkinson to compete with. But I do find it interesting when these teams go out and target a guy like Osborne. Potentially there could be a larger role. And I think he's even more forgotten, Billy, because they took Jalen Polk and they took Javon Baker in the 2nd and 4th round. I think people are sort of on drafting the rookie wide receivers, but I don't want to spend too much time on New England.
Just real quick, last thing we'll talk about, though, is when we talk about these teams, we said it earlier, coaches change, systems change. This is one of a handful of teams where the entire coaching staff is different, right? Jared Mayo is the new head coach. We have Van Pelt, who is the new offensive coordinator. We have Covington as the new defensive coordinator. There's 3 new coaches here in this system. This team could be flipped upside down. We're looking at a completely different system now.
Yeah, agreed. I think the early reports are they're going to lean on these running backs, which I think is like, it sort of makes Antonio Gibson the guy who's got the value, Billy, because like if we have all these question marks about the wide receivers and who the targets are going to, Gibson could just step in and have 50 catches this year. And if anything happens to Stevenson, you get that contingent upside where he would be a top 20 play, top 15 play at the running back position every single week. So Gibson's a guy we've always sort of liked the talent on. Again, it's not that exciting an offense. Let's stay with an unexciting offense. Denver. You talked a little bit about Courtland Sutton last week. Why don't you talk a little bit about him more? I'm contractually obligated to feed Billy Muzio a Courtland Sutton question.
We don't need to go to Courtland Sutton. Though. I would like to say, though, that I'm not expecting the defense to be, exceptional this year. The offense was kind of middle of the pack last year, probably looking at a little bit worse in general, right? They were 19th in fantasy points per game. They're 24th in passing yards. So I do think that we're probably going to be in that low 20 range again, most likely. But the defense might be so bad that we are looking at a lot of passing opportunities, which is going to benefit Courtland Sutton. So there's, I don't think there's any coaching changes here, right? Denver, it's still Peyton, Lombardi, and Vance Joseph. So it's another year in the system there for Sutton. And so I look at this and say Peyton cleaned house a little bit and is keeping the guys that he likes. When we see this happen, especially in the Lombardi offense, we talked about Lombardi and the X receivers and what they've done in the past. This is going to benefit Courtland Sutton.
Yeah. And the running back position in Denver, and just to kind of, I've been trying to follow the Denver media reports and sort of like the projected depth charts as much as possible, because I find myself interested in Marvin Mims, find myself interested in Troy Franklin, those type of guys. But
and Mims is cheap right now.
Mims is super cheap. But right now, the Denver media also is saying don't discount Tim Patrick. So there's Tim Patrick and Josh Reynolds.
He hasn't played in like 4 years.
I know. But it's like these younger players, there's not like people pounding the table being like, no, these younger guys are on the field. If anything, it's like right now it's Sutton next to Reynolds and Patrick. So the fact is, it's like one guy who, like you said, can't stay on the field in Tim Patrick, and the other guy, Josh Reynolds, who had like a solid year.
Reynolds is sneaky.
65 targets or something last year. And yeah, he played well last year for Detroit. He was a guy that I had to write about in the waiver wire column a couple times, and he was a spot start type guy. But at the end of the day, it sort of makes me like Courtland Sutton a little bit more. And also add the fact that the tight end is Greg Dulcich, a guy who hasn't really been able to do anything. Had a couple of games as a rookie and then missed last year with injury. So it's really like Courtland Sutton and a whole lot of question marks. Running back is interesting because I think there is backfield competition. I think taking shots on a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin who can catch the ball is always an interesting one for me. Certainly there's some competition for him there with Audric Estime, Blake Watson, and then Javonte Williams is still there. Javonte just sort of doesn't get me excited at all. But I agree with you. I think Courtland Sutton right now, I actually think his ADP will go up as we move along into the summer, as people kind of say that he's not great, but he could get 130 targets this year, Billy.
That's exactly what it is. It's going to break down to the overall pie and the shares and the opportunity that he's going to see. Not to mention he was just a red zone stud last year as well.
So here's one that's not quite as faded. I think people are actually interested in a couple players, but Carolina was absolutely a train wreck of an offense last year. Anybody who had Bryce Young in Dynasty knew how bad that situation was. Then this year they've gone out and done a couple of interesting things. They drafted Jonathan Brooks as the first running back off the board. He steamed up to running back 24 on Underdog. I know, shout out to our friend Bradley Stalder, who is the host of Stack Hunters, doing great work with Dan Williamson over there. He's huge on Jonathan Brooks. Then you've got Deontay Johnson, who comes over in a trade from Pittsburgh. Deontay Johnson, by all accounts, is looking like the main target in the passing game there right now. Do these new weapons interest you? Do you think that this is and also you talk about new schemes. You go from having like an offensive system where they couldn't really get out of their own way to adding Dave Canales, who is a guy that, if by all accounts, is a very sharp guy who has all sorts of success over the years at multiple stops. Russell Wilson's best ever season attached to Dave Canales. Geno Smith's best season attached to Dave Canales. Baker Mayfield last year. And Billy, Rachaad White, 322 touches last year with Dave Canales. Now he goes out and drafts a back like Jonathan Brooks. If Jonathan Brooks is healthy, I'm kind of into him right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity in the backfield. I keep thinking that Miles Sanders might do something one year, but I think I'm able to cut the cord. I don't think I'm drafting much Miles Sanders this year, even though I would love for him to be a thing. I loved him coming out of college, just never really kind of equated to anything. But again, you talked about the head coaching changes. Canales is there. They also got, is it Idzik? I always mispronounce his last name. I think it's Idzik.
Yeah. So it is now. Once we establish a pronunciation, we're not getting away from it.
There you go.
Like Oregon.
Yeah, not like Oregon. But Idzik is there as well. So we're looking at a new system, new head coach, new offense. I would say Deontay Johnson is going to help this team. Just because, I mean, we saw Adam Thielen kind of fall off a cliff last year, and let's face it, Terrace Marshall and Mingo probably aren't the answers either. So they needed to add someone like Xavier. So there's I think a balance this year. I don't think they're going to be significantly much higher than they were last year. They were 31st in points per game, 32nd in passing yards, 20th in rushing yards. I think both these statistics are bound to increase, but I wouldn't say they're going to be anywhere near middle of the league.
They also addressed the interior offensive line through free agency. They brought in a couple guys. I think that'll help. I'll say this, even if the offense doesn't take a step forward, if there's some rational coaching and like a ton of consolidation, we did see last year, even when the offense was really bad, Adam Thielen was giving us wide receiver 1 production just because he was getting this insane target share. So if Bryce Young, maybe that's his thing, is he keys into his top target, and that's fine. We like predictability. Then Deontay Johnson can beat his ADP. The one warning sign, and I'll say I took Deontay Johnson. I've been taking him on underdog, and I also took him in a FFPC Triflex startup last week. That's a wide receiver heavy Superflex format. So I took him in a dynasty startup, not reaching, but I was happy to get him where I got him. Pittsburgh doesn't usually miss. When guys leave Pittsburgh, they've usually left their best fantasy success behind them. It's not like they go to a new team and all of a sudden just put up better fantasy numbers. It's usually Pittsburgh's like, you want to go, or we'll trade you this guy. It doesn't come back to burn him. So that would be the one warning sign. Now, Malik Neighbors has steamed up. And I think Malik Neighbors, it's actually, Billy, we'll talk about a little bit more of like historical ADP trends and what we're seeing in the ADP market as we move along here on First Class Fantasy. But what's interesting is Marvin Harrison Jr. is the highest drafted rookie wide receiver ever, not even close. But Malik Neighbors right now is also the highest. He's being drafted ahead of where we saw any rookie wide receiver. And I think justifiably, he's going off the board as wide receiver 20. But let's take him out of the way. When you take Malik Neighbors out of the way, and he's going 29th overall on underdog, it's pretty much the same situation as last year. Last year, you had nobody wide receiver for New York that drafters were betting on. After Neighbors, nobody's betting on any of these wide receivers. Now Darren Waller's gone. There's no tight end people are betting on. Running back wise is interesting. We both talked a little bit in the pre-show about Devin Singletary. Talk about your thoughts on Singletary.
I like Singletary just because of the opportunity. There's not a lot of running backs here in this backfield, and we've seen what they've done in the past. They've kind of leaned into the rushing game even when they can't run the ball, and so Dable is going to continue to do so. It's also, if you just look at the passing game, I mean, last year was kind of the joke about how many wide receivers they had in this offense, and they still have 14 receivers right now on the depth chart. So they're just trying to find somebody else to hit here. So Neighbors, of course, is going to be the bread and butter, but they went out and even signed Allen Robinson. They still have Hyatt from last year. Slayton was a surprise a bit last year. Wandale has missed a lot of time. So Singletary might be pretty involved in the passing game as well. And then there's going to open up a lot of available targets. So 130 available targets right now. And I think that could change, especially, with Waller. So there's quite a bit of targets here that are available. Daniel Jones has been kind of this inconsistent quarterback, I'd say the least. But I think that this is an offense that could be a big bounce back candidate.
Yeah, and they have a defense that can put pressure on you too. I think it's a sneaky one. Malik Neighbors, I think, like we'll talk about him on another First Class Fantasy, but I love Malik Neighbors and what he could bring to the table, even with his expensive price tag. But Singletary's interesting because I think that his best competition is going to end up being Tyrone Tracy, who's like a next level athlete, sort of like an Antonio Gibson type, was a former wide receiver at Iowa, ends up playing running back for a year in the Big Ten. I think a great way of going about things, if you're in a deeper best ball or if you're in a dynasty league, is double tapping this position, Singletary and Tracy. I think you're going to get some weekly production from that. Definitely an interesting one, but we got to get over to the bounce back candidates, and we're going to give you our top 5. And we argued on this one. This is a tough one. I think also it's sort of a trying to determine what a bounce back candidate is. There's not like a set rule for what a guy is. So we kind of have different interpretations of certain things, but end of the day, I think our top 5 is guys that you should be drafting, especially at cost, that we both agree could have really, really successful seasons. But I want to talk about a few guys who didn't make our top 5, but definitely are warranted of discussion. Billy, we drafted a lot of high stakes leagues last year together, and one guy that we saw steaming up, out of control steam, who actually passed Terry McLaurin in ADP late in the summer. McLaurin got a little dinged up, and Jahan Dotson kept rising and rising. He ends up passing McLaurin in ADP. Like when we got to Las Vegas, every single draft you saw, Jahan Dotson would go in the 6th round, 5th round for some of these NFFCs, and FFPC 6th round every draft. Like people were really banking on this being a huge year 2 breakout. He ends up failing horribly. And we saw Curtis Samuel actually pass him by in every single category. People were cutting Jahan Dotson even from 20-man high-stakes formats. Big, huge disappointment last year. Do we see a bounce back this year?
I think it's going to happen. I'm pretty committed to Jahan Dotson this year. We're talking about the 3rd most available targets in the league. The Commanders at 274 available targets. We talk about the coaching changes. This is one of the few handful of teams that have all 3, head coach, offensive coordinator, and DC all being changed. Cliff Kingsbury now here as the offensive coordinator, which is good news for Jahan Dotson as well. Jahan Dotson, it wasn't like he wasn't on the field last year. It's just he didn't have the chemistry with the quarterback, and now he gets a new quarterback, a new coach, a new offensive coordinator. He had 626 routes run last year, which is the 4th most in the league. So he got his cardio in. This year, we're expecting him, or I'm expecting him to at least capitalize on this cardio. And he was out there. It wasn't like he was just out there as a decoy, blocking or doing some BS. He actually had route participation of 98.4, which is 20th in the league as well. So I think that the arrow is pointing up for Jahan Dotson. He finished as the wide receiver 67 in fantasy points per game last year. That's a significant decline from 2022, where he finished as wide receiver 38. And so I think he's going to be much closer to wide receiver 38 than he is going to be to 67. So I think he's an extreme value this year.
Yeah, certainly where you have to take him, it's a guy you can bet on. He's going off the board as wide receiver 61 on Underdog. I think that there's just a lack of enthusiasm. He's sort of a structural play for a lot of people who are stacking Jayden Daniels, but I don't think there's a ton of steam. So him beating wide receiver 61, I think he'll beat wide receiver 61. Now, can he beat wide receiver 61 to an extent where he has a chance to go into your fantasy lineup? That's a question mark. But I do think that, like you said, there's available targets. A lot of times, and also Billy, it's a guy who we've seen have success on an NFL field. It's not like we're hoping and wishing. It's not like a Quentin Johnston where we just haven't seen it. With Jahan Dotson, we had a really nice stretch during his rookie year, and then, of course, last year falls off. So definitely a very interesting player to discuss. Now, one player who also is on the Washington Commanders is Austin Ekeler. And this is one where we talked about in the beginning of the show about people being angry. I'm never drafting that guy again. And I'll tell you what, Billy, I say I never want to do it, but it's hard for me to click that button because last year Ekeler was a guy that was just a lack of impact on my fantasy team. And we talked about also how guys finished the year. Ekeler was awful to end the year. Had a really good fantasy playoff schedule, couldn't turn that thing around. He was, of course, running back 1 overall in 2022, and then last year ends up falling off. Signs with Washington on a 2-year contract. He's now in a backfield with Brian Robinson, who was a low-end RB2 last year, but basically on the power of 9 touchdowns, not because he was just such a great player or such an efficient player. So Ekeler, do you see Ekeler as a guy that is appealing to you? He's going off the board as running back 35.
35, I'm pulling the trigger. I mean, 20, he's RB 21 last year. He had several years, the previous 4 years inside the top 10, although it is a completely new system, new coach, everything. But the way I look at it is he's probably going to take on the bulk of the receiving work out of the backfield. Brian Robinson, not necessarily a receiving back. We just talked about all the available targets that were there. So I think he has an opportunity to outperform the ADP. I'm not comfortable with him like at RB 25 or higher, but I'd be comfortable with him as RB 30 in that range, as my RB 2 or even my RB, most likely my RB 2. But he has an opportunity to outperform that. Not someone I'm going to bank on because we just see him now, at the tail end age that he's now 29 years old. And so anytime we see this in a running back, it's getting to that age cliff where it's not necessarily gonna be good for him if he continues to keep playing and is going to benefit. Now the tread and the tire the last couple of years were pretty high, but prior to 2020, it was pretty low tread. So I still think he's got another year in him, and maybe a new system and a new coach will do well for him.
Smash the like button if you're enjoying First Class Fantasy. Billy and I will be here every single Thursday helping you win in your leagues. And Austin Ekeler winning our leagues this year, I don't know, Billy. I'll say, you say you want to target him as running back 35 overall. He's actually going back-to-back with Brian Robinson, who's younger, and now potentially the goal line back in a improving offense in Washington that we're both sort of bullish on. Head-to-head, if you could only have one of them, Brian Robinson or Ekeler, because they're essentially going back-to-back.
I'm always going to go for the PPR side, so I'm going to go for Ekeler just because of the targets. I mean, he's still on a down year. We saw 74 targets last year out of Ekeler, and so Brian Robinson is never getting to that number ever in his career, probably. And so I would say I'm going to go for the upside of the receptions, the upside of the receiving touchdowns, and being able to get open in the field. So I'm always going to go with the PPR back.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And the fact that they went out and brought Ekeler in, it's a guy like Austin Ekeler also, it's sort of the veteran deference where these coaching staffs will want to lean into a guy who's had this much success in the league. He's sort of a high character guy that, I mean, everybody loves Austin Ekeler. And at the end of the day, Brian Robinson was a Ron Rivera guy. Like, Ron Rivera loved Brian Robinson. We talked about Antonio Gibson. He's sort of brushed aside for Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson also, like, you bring up Ekeler as a guy who caught a lot of passes. Like, Brian Robinson didn't have that reputation, but a lot of his fantasy success last year was driven by the fact that he had 36 receptions. He turned that into 368 receiving yards, and he had 4 receiving touchdowns. The Eric Bieniemy early season screen game with Robinson was really, really strong. Robinson had a lot of front-loaded fantasy production last year, and a lot of it was in the passing game. So Ekeler being there caps what Robinson can do as a receiver. It makes him less of a fun click. The only way that you're really going to see a lot of a smash value from Robinson is if he becomes a really, really strong goal line threat. Now you got Jayden Daniels there who could be the goal line back to begin with. So definitely not to get too off tangent there. But talking about bounce-back candidates, I tweeted this 2 days ago. Chris Godwin has a little bit of steam right now in Tampa Bay. The new offensive coordinator, Liam Cohen, made a point of saying that Godwin is the slot receiver. We're putting him back in the slot. Now, Godwin in 2021 was wide receiver 7 in points per game, 57.5% slot rate. 2022, 57.6% slot rate, wide receiver 15. Last year falls to wide receiver 34 in points per game, 32.1% slot rate. So, Billy, is an older wide receiver like Godwin going to return some fantasy success playing his natural position like slot rate, or like the slot position, or is this a kind of a false flag still I want to avoid?
I don't ever like to say I'm avoiding a player because if the price is right, I'm always going to buy depending upon what
wide receiver 40. I'll put context. Wide receiver 41 right now on Underdog.
Okay.
It's not. You're not making people feel confident with.
Yeah, I'm not confident in Godwin. I mean, I could see where he finishes around there. I could see where if he outperforms it, he's going to be as wide receiver like 35, 34. But I don't see him significantly outperforming that ADP. So I think he's probably appropriately priced. The problem that I have with him, it's not like he was injured last year. He still played 17 games. He just wasn't a factor. And so Baker tends to lock into one player, and that player to me is Evans. And I think that they're going to, they're going to get Godwin involved, but when it comes to a situation that he needs to rely on someone, I think Baker just continues to shove the ball and push it to Evans. And so I'm not sold on a bounce back for Chris Godwin. I would have deleted his name on the sheet, but I know you wanted to talk about him. And so
I want to talk about him.
so I'm just going to say I'm not confident in the bounce back year for Godwin.
Billy Muzio with the sound effect. He's saying fade Chris Godwin. Really didn't like that one. Let's go Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, this is one where Obviously people were drafting him in the first round last year, gets hurt. Then this was sort of like the look at how smart I am. I'm going to keep drafting him because he's going to come back. And then you had him falling to like the 6th round. Had a couple of decent games, but at the end of the day, certainly fell off a ton in production. Ends the season with 59 receptions, 737 receiving yards, 5 touchdown catches. He's back up to wide receiver 24. Now, Puka Nacua last year sets the rookie record for receptions, sets the rookie record for receiving yards in an NFL playoff game. Puka just goes nuts. Puka's up to wide receiver 6 now on Underdog. Do you have interest in Cooper Kupp at wide receiver 24 right now?
I mean, I'll take a share or two. It's not somebody I'm going to lock in and go out of my way to draft. I think people are just stuck on drafting him from 21 and 22. I think that his days as a wide receiver 1 are gone, and he might be an okay piece to have, but I'm just not confident that he can stay on the field to stay healthy now at this point. He's almost 31. And I think that he's, being not necessarily faded out, but I just think that his time as the wide receiver 1 on his own team is gone now. Puka's there to stay, and I don't think that's going to change this year. And so I'd say it's an interesting conversation because people are afraid of Cooper Kupp, of what he can do. But I think that that's now a time of the past, and I think that that's going to remain a what can he do versus what will he do.
I also think it's interesting for me, Billy, where it's like Kupp's there. If I'm stacking the Rams and I'm forcing that stack with, if I've taken Puka and I want to have a Kupp, Puka, Stafford, I get it. But when it comes to like redraft and I'm looking at the guys around him, Zay Flowers, wide receiver 25, Tank Dell, wide receiver 26, George Pickens, wide receiver 28. You have sort of the younger unknown upside type outcomes versus a guy that I think we can all agree has played his best fantasy. It would be impossible for Cooper Kupp to get back to that previous level. Whereas some of these other guys, if it all bounces their way, you could see them get into wide receiver 1 land. So I'm going to fade as well. I'm not that excited about him. I know there's some out there very excited about him. We're working on our player profiler draft kit, and I've had a couple people request Cooper Kupp as their cameo. A shout out to Mark Garcia. Hilo is going to be doing it. I said we got to blow some dust off of that one before we let you fill it out, Mark. But shout out to Mark. I hope you're doing well out there, Hilo. And let's talk Garrett Wilson. Why wasn't Garrett Wilson on this list? We both think Garrett Wilson's going to smash, but at the end of the day, Billy, he's going about the same in drafts as he was last year. So it's not like there was any sort of correction, but maybe share your early thoughts on Wilson.
Yeah. I mean, this is someone I think this is almost like a cheat code if we put him on the list, just because we were robbed last year of having like a top 10 positional
top 5.
finish.
Top 5.
Yeah, maybe even top 5. But I think we were definitely robbed of that last year once Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles, and we just got this disgusting play at quarterback for the remainder of the season. And despite that, he still finished as wide receiver 26 in PPR. So I think that he's bound for a bounce back here. Arguably could have been the number 1 person on our list, but just based upon the scenario and the reasons, we put him on the outside of make sure we'll touch up base on him, but he's not going to be the focal point.
Yeah, I mean, he's wide receiver 8 right now on Underdog. I think he'll be there when you're drafting FFPCs as well. He's locked in, and he's an elite target earner. The guy had 147 targets as a rookie, 168 targets last year, and despite like the struggles that New York had at the quarterback spot, Wilson still caught 95 passes. He's just a stud. I think that this is like Jets fans deserve a Garrett Wilson smash season this year. I think they're going to get it. I think he's absolutely like when you get Garrett Wilson in the second round, I think that's a really great way to start your draft. It makes it a very dangerous build. A lot of times he sneaks into the back end of the first round as well. He's just a really, really good player. But one player that you wanted to have on the top 5, and I pushed back, Jonathan Taylor. Now, Jonathan Taylor last year, again, it's sort of like will he beat his ADP from last year? I mean, will he beat his production? Sure. But he missed a ton of time, and also he fell in drafts because of the contract situation, and then later the injury plus the contract. But right now, here's my problem with Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor is going off the board at 16 overall. Chat, let us know what you think of Jonathan Taylor at 16 overall on Underdog. For me, it's just I can't click that button. I think that when you talk about Jonathan Taylor, when he finished as RB1 overall, he had 40 receptions. If I'm going to draft a guy at 16 overall, though, Billy, I want him to have a chance to finish as RB1 overall. And at the end of the day, most of the time, RB1 overall has averaged like 80 catches a year. So it's like he was a huge outlier his 1 year when he was able to finish at that level. I also worry a little bit about Anthony Richardson vulturing those goal line touchdowns away from him. Why don't you make the bull case for Taylor and explain why you take him around 15 overall?
Yeah, I think the big part of this is that he missed the first 4 games last year with that ankle injury, and Zach Moss played well, so he didn't really have the backfield to himself up until about week 9, and then he logged it was about 75% of the overall snaps and a 60+% of the rushing attempts. So I would expect now with Moss gone a similar usage in 2024, where now we have a Colts offense that's on the rise. We have a quarterback that has significant rushing upside ability and is going to open up the field. The Colts ran RPO 18% of the time, which was the highest rate in the league. And I think it's going to lead to plenty of light boxes here for Jonathan Taylor. And anytime you have Jonathan Taylor able to run the light box, this is where we talk about that upside finish that you said, that outlier, where now that outlier becomes a realistic possibility of him potentially leading the league in rushing yards just because of the situation with the Colts offense. So I like Jonathan Taylor this year at ADP. I know it's scaring some people, but we're talking about last year, 10 games and still had about 750 rushing yards. So it's not like he's out here, running like a bum under 4 yards a carry. He still averaged about 4.5 yards a carry last year and finished as the RB12 in fantasy points per game. So I like the upside here. I do think that you touch on a very important subject of the lack of involvement in the passing game is real. If we can get closer to that 40 reception mark like we saw in 2021 and 2020, I think that he has a better chance of doing so, but he does need to see a handful more receptions. But I like him at ADP this year.
One thing that we talked about in the pre-show, and a quick shout out to Chuka in the comments. Like, he brings up Bijan, Brees, CMC. Those guys are all going ahead of Taylor, but he brings up ETN. Like, Billy, I'll say this: Travis Etienne is 38 overall on Underdog. Like, so I'm getting Travis Etienne 23 spots behind Jonathan Taylor. I think Etienne could outscore him this year. I don't think it's necessarily a slam dunk, but I think that there's a range of outcomes where Etienne has more fantasy points than Taylor, and I'm able to get him a little later. So it's sort of like I can see your argument. Billy, also say Saquon Barkley's going side by side with Taylor. Taylor or Saquon Barkley? Saquon's like literally 15 and Taylor's 15.9.
This is one that I would say you need to own both of them because both of them could hurt you significantly.
If you have a single entry in fantasy and you have drafted one team a year.
If I have single entry, I'm going Barkley.
Okay, you're going single. So there you go. There you go. Head to head, Billy Muzio answering it. But one good point that I think we talked about in the pre-show was the success Zach Moss had in this offense. That is a check mark for Taylor, because we can both agree that he's a more talented player, and now he's going to be in this same offense. And this offense was very fantasy friendly to the running back position. So we'll see. We'll see. I'm definitely a Jonathan Taylor guy. And a question in the chat from Dakota. I think Taylor's fine in Dynasty. He's insulated by the contract. I just wouldn't overpay for him. Because, again, I think it's going to be difficult for him to get back to running back 1 overall land. If the person in your league is valuing him like that, I would pass up. But if he's being valued sort of like in the ETN range of running backs, then it becomes a little bit more of a target in Dynasty. Okay, Billy, we're getting to it. We're going to reveal our top 5 bounce-back candidates. And the first one I think is interesting because it's one who's a little bit under the radar right now, and that's Pat Freiermuth. And this is a guy where we saw him have instant success, second-round draft pick out of Penn State, has instant success in fantasy, where he was a guy who was started everywhere, not at the beginning of his rookie year, but he was like a second half of the year smash play. Then he takes a step forward in year 2. In year 2 of his career, he gets 98 targets, gets nearly 100 targets, and finishes, I believe, as tight end 7 in PPR. Last year was a disaster, completely injured, unimpactful. He had one game, sort of fell flat. Now there's reports that he could be essentially the number 2 target in the passing game behind Pickens, essentially filling in as the wide receiver 2 role, with Jaylen Warren getting some work out of the backfield. But what I found interesting, the stat that I love, is with Arthur Smith's Atlanta Falcons last year, they finished 3rd overall in tight end targets, but they were 25th overall in total targets. So they had a huge outsized number of tight end targets. And Kyle Pitts ends up getting 90 targets last year. And Jonnu Smith actually got 74 targets last year. So if he can just step into the Arthur Smith featured tight end role with a lack of a clarity at the wide receiver 2 spot, we like Roman Wilson, but again, that's a rookie 3rd round pick. Pat Freiermuth could have more targets, I think, than we saw from him in 2022. I think he could be a very sneaky player in terms of the production he's going to give you. And Billy, I love the price right now. He's tight end 16 on Underdog.
Yeah, this is a mispriced player in my opinion, and it will correct, I think, as we get closer to the season. This is one of those players that you see ADP currently, and this is where you look at. Sometimes you look at rosters when they win an overall tournament or they win an overall league, and you're like, how did they build that team, right? Well, this is how you draft early, and there's people who are mispriced, and then they climb in ADP 20, 30, 40, 50 spots sometimes, depending upon news. And there's just no way that you should be able to get him at that price. Well, that's where we're at with Pat Freiermuth right now. You're drafting him at the absolute floor. When you look at range of outcomes, there's not a scenario that I can think about that was going to put him much lower than where he's being drafted at right now. Last year with Pickett, we saw this offense, how much it struggled. Pickett had a dreadful 71.9% passable catch rate. And I know Russell Wilson had a bad year last year, and there's a lot of people joking around about Russell Wilson and his career and where they're at and the money they spent. But even Russell Wilson last year had a catchable pass rate of 75.6%. And you went through all the changes at the offensive coordinator position, but also just in general at the wide receiver. There's only one familiar face really inside of the top 3 in the passing game right now, and that's George Pickens. They went out and they got Van Jefferson, they got Roman Wilson, they got, Troy. I can't say Troy's last name. Can you say it for me, Theo? Fatanu, is that how you say his last name?
Fatanu.
Yeah. So,
I mean, you got that right, Billy.
I think I did get that right. But there's a lot of new faces here. And so I know that this is now new for Russell Wilson as well, but head coach is still the same. Freiermuth already knows. He's familiar, I should say, with George Pickens and being on the field. There's a lot of benefits to being already on this team and not having to come out and prove yourself to the head coach like these rookies are going to have to do. And so I think that Pat Freiermuth is bound for a huge bounce back. And I would say definitely possible for him to be inside the top 12 position as a tight end 1, and with the option of being potentially inside the top 10th position.
Yeah, it's very odd. And I think the other thing about him is, the tight end market this year, we're targeting a lot of these top end tight ends. It's actually a really exciting year for tight end. If you look at tight ends last year to score 200 or more PPR points, it was like an outsized number. There's like a trend towards having one of these guys, but I think he can actually be a little bit of a cheat code. Billy, he goes behind Cole Kmet, who is now competing with targets for, like, I'll take him ahead of Kmet all day long right now.
All day.
Not even close. Kmet is it's 3 wide receivers who are going to out-target him, and also DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. Then the same thing with Dalton Schultz, where Dalton Schultz now has to compete not only with Dell and Collins, but also has to compete with Mixon out of the backfield and Stephon Diggs. So it's another boxed out situation. And then Pat Freiermuth is going behind Dallas Goedert, who again is the number 3 target, and also Saquon Barkley is going to get more touches than we've seen any running back in Philly in recent years get, and TJ Hawkinson, who's going to miss potentially half the year. So Muth is definitely mispriced. I think he's a talented player who's been impactful for us in fantasy before, and I think this could be his big bounce back season. I love that we sort of discovered that one. Big hat tip to Billy and Theo. If you like us giving you steals. And make sure you hit that like button. Let's keep this one going. Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray's our number 4 bounce back. This one's easy. Kyler Murray last year, he didn't burn you at ADP because you weren't drafting him. A lot of people were letting him. I mean, even in FFPC and NFFC, Billy, he was a hard one to draft because you would have had to hold him potentially through all these bye weeks, and there was no guarantee that he was going to come back at any point. Then he beats expectations, comes back, and then all the naysayers were like, Murray's going to lose it as a runner. Like, we have to adjust our expectations. This is coming off of an injury. He's not going to be as dynamic, and he was completely the same. He had the same escapability, the same rushing ability, the explosiveness, the ability to extend plays in the pocket, which is really an underrated part of his game. And now he gets Marvin Harrison Jr., best wide receiver he's had since he lost DeAndre Hopkins. And Trey McBride, he had several smash games with McBride last year. McBride is a candidate to finish as tight end 1 overall this year. They signed Zay Jones. You get Michael Wilson a year older. They draft Trey Benson, a running back who, like James Conner, can catch the ball out of the backfield and has explosiveness. I mean, Kyler Murray right now, Billy, he's a very, very good value at quarterback 8.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Kyler here, so 10 games last season, of course, like you said, came off that ACL tear from December 2022. He still averaged the 4.25 yards per carry, 18.9 fantasy points per game from then on. That was actually quarterback 9, Theo, during that span. So even coming off that injury, which all of us kind of like, I was one that said his rushing was going to decline. Looking at the numbers, it just logically made sense from a statistical standpoint and what quarterbacks had done coming off of those injuries. And Kyler was just a little unique there. And so the craziest thing about it was that from weeks, I think it was 13 on, it might've been week 12. He didn't have Hollywood Brown. And so he really did this with just Trey McBride and a bunch of, shit inside the receiving game. So the fact that he has Marvin Harrison now, he's got the full season prepare, off season prepare, I should say. He gets the addition of Trey Benson. Michael Wilson, like you mentioned, is probably going to step up as a viable third option. So I think that the ceiling is pointing up for Kyler. Because in 2 seasons now, as full seasons, I should say, as starting, because we had his rookie season, which I'm not going to count, and then we had the injured season. He's been quarterback number 6 or better. So I think that that's within the range of possibilities again.
Yeah, definitely an exciting one. And I think that one's sort of an easy click. And also, Billy, the ability to stack. Like Kyler Murray, you have multiple options to stack now. You can stack him, obviously, with Marvin Harrison Jr. You could stack him with Trey McBride, stack him with both. I think that this is an ascending team as well. I think Arizona is a playoff team this year. I think Kyler's going to win some games. This is a team on the rise and an offense on the rise. Also, it's a offense where they're year 2 in the same program, whereas new coaching staff last year, they have some continuity now. This is an exciting one. Our next player, this is also exciting. We're talking about Devonta Smith. And Devonta Smith last year certainly didn't fall off of a ledge, but if you drafted last year, you were not happy about what Devonta Smith gave you. Devonta Smith was very slow out the gate, so you got off to a slow start with your fantasy team. He was drafted essentially as a early second-round pick in redraft, and certainly in best ball streets as well. The reason was because he was so good in 2022. In 2022, he gave you essentially, I believe he finished as a wide receiver 1, but in points per game, he was wide receiver 14. So year 2 averages 15 points per game, and he had 136 targets, and he had a 27% target share. So A.J. Brown smashed and Devonta Smith both smashed same year. Drafters adjusted it. Devonta Smith, people were betting on, he was getting pushed up. And then last year, Billy, the Philadelphia Eagles offense takes a big step back, especially as the second half of the year. A.J. Brown had like a 30% target share, but Devonta Smith falls down to 22.8 target share. So the target share drops about 5%, and he goes down in total targets from 136 down to 112. Still gives you wide receiver 20 overall. Now, I have big hopes for Devonta Smith bouncing back. We have Kellen Moore. You talked about last week about how we think we could see, career high passing numbers from Jalen Hurts. And the market has sort of corrected itself on Devonta Smith. Devonta Smith is being drafted at wide receiver 22. So he's actually being drafted lower than his points per game last year. This is a player who is entering his fourth season in the league. This is a very talented player. I think that he's an absolute smash at wide receiver 22. What are your thoughts here on Devonta Smith?
Yeah, I think 22 is an overcorrection, right? We talk about players who are burnt, or I should say fantasy players that were burnt by NFL players, and they just cross them off their list. This is one of those players people are crossing off. Even in that down year with those statistics, I mean, we look at what he did from just being on the field standpoint. He was on the field for 583 routes, which is number 10 in the league. He was on the field 100, or I should say route participation 100% of the time, Theo. So he was tied for number 1 at the position. Snap share 97.2%, which was wide receiver number 1 at the position. And so he is on the field. It's just a matter of getting some more consistent targets. Kellen Moore will get creative and getting him the ball. Air yards, he was still the top 19. So we're talking about a lot of metrics that we look at to gauge a fantasy's player's success for future success, I should say. And all the metrics he's hitting on. Remember last year I talked to you, I don't know if I did on the pod or off air, but I created this metric that players, if they hit like 5 of the 6 of these metrics, they were bound for like a top 15 season at the position. And right now, just by mentioning a few of these and looking at the rest of the chart, he hits 5 of those 6 right off the bat.
That's awesome. The Muzio model, Billy charges $299 for it. If you're interested in it, put it in the chat and we'll get in touch with you right after the show. Billy will even call you up. So guys, Devonta Smith, we both are into. I think it speaks volume to the quality of the wide receiver position, the fact that he's wide receiver 22, because usually I have I definitely would take him over a couple players around him. I'll say I'm more interested in Devonta Smith than DK Metcalf, who's wide receiver 23. I'm more interested in Devonta Smith than I am Michael Pittman Jr., who's wide receiver 21. And I like Pittman Jr. Your thoughts on those head-to-head battles, Devonta Smith versus those two guys?
I like him. I like them all, but yeah. I would say I like Devonta Smith. I'm always going to go for the one on the better offense, and I think that this is the Eagles. But I do think that's you're never going to get me to say one player there. I'm always going to say, Theo, you got to diversify. You have to make sure you have shares of everybody. That's my answer. I'm always going to take that cop out way, but it's because I believe in it.
Okay, so something a little bit interesting is going on here. I'm going to talk about a player who might be the greatest ever at his position in the history of the NFL, and that's Patrick Mahomes. And when we talk about a bounce-back candidate, it's because Patrick Mahomes last year, anybody who drafted him, again, much like Devonta Smith, the win rates, it was a very disappointing outcome if you drafted Patrick Mahomes, especially in some of these high-stakes formats where the quarterback position got steamed up. You were actually having to use very high draft capital on Patrick Mahomes last year. Billy, this is Patrick Mahomes' points per game finishes since 2018. Number 1 overall, number 6 overall, number 2 overall, number 5 overall, number 2 overall in 2022, and then fell to a career low number 10 overall last year in 2023. Certainly he won the Super Bowl. So, big hat tip to you real life football people, but I'm a fantasy football person. And when we're talking about Patrick Mahomes, 10 overall is not going to cut it. But now what did Kansas City go do in the offseason? They drafted a wide receiver in the first round for the first time since 2011 in Xavier Worthy. They went out and signed Hollywood Brown. So they're adding 2 very fast, very dynamic talents at the wide receiver spot. Now, Rashee Rice was a big-time hit for them last year. And Rashee Rice is not going to miss the whole year. In fact, Rashee Rice could miss a lot less time than some people think. And then Travis Kelce, who was supposed to retire, according to some, signs a 2-year extension. So they also shored up the offensive line in the draft as well. So you have improved wide receivers. You have a low bar of one of the best quarterbacks of all time at QB 10 in points per game. this is like the easiest bounce back candidate of all time, Billy. And the market has corrected itself. You're able to draft Patrick Mahomes as QB4. So if you want to draft quarterback early, I'm having to spend a QB4 price on Mahomes as opposed to having to take him as like QB2. I'm getting Mahomes I'm getting Mahomes 14 spots below Josh Allen. I think with these new weapons, this could be the Mahomes revenge tour where Josh Allen loses all these targets, Mahomes gains all these big-time talented players. This could be Patrick Mahomes back to QB1 overall.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Mahomes just because we all know he's great, and we could sit here and just talk about how good he is, and I'm just not going to do that. But the one thing I want to talk about that I think it really needs to be discussed is the ability to attack the deep ball this year. Going back to 2021, 2020, back to the Tyreek days where he was consistently throwing the ball deep, top 5, top 6 in the league, versus the last couple of years where he's been 10, 11, 12th overall in deep ball attempts. I think that we look at this offense and the way they've built it, and they're looking at throwing deep again. They go out and get Marquise Brown, like you mentioned, who's had a 41-yard or long catch or more in the last 5 years, I should say. They go out and get Xavier Worthy, who now holds a new 40-yard dash record. So speed and throwing the ball deep again are something that I think the Chiefs want to do, and I think that it's something they're going to attack, and they want to give Mahomes that weapon, which is, of course, going to open up the running game, and of course, going to open up the middle of the field, which is going to benefit Travis Kelce as well. So I think them planning on big plays again is what's in store for the Chiefs.
Love it. And big drum roll, Billy, because we're going to reveal our number 1 bounce back candidate, and it's Kyle Pitts. This is the Kyle Pitts revenge tour. Kyle Pitts has been a player where you haven't had an ADP win with Pitts ever, because his rookie year, he actually had a really, really solid rookie season where he gets over 70 receptions, or excuse me, over I think it was 67 receptions, but he went over 1,000 yards receiving. But the problem is he didn't score touchdowns, and drafters were steaming him up in ADP. Then year 2, disaster. Last year, incredible frustration with the Jonnu Smith success. So Pitts actually had some games last year. Collectively, Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts gave us like 12 top 10 weeks. But the problem was you couldn't predict which one was doing it. Now it's like a light at the end of the tunnel. 23-year-old Kyle Pitts now is in a system with Kirk Cousins, Zach Robinson instead of Arthur Smith. The consistency is there. And guess what? Jonnu Smith is gone. He's a Miami Dolphin. We talk a lot about tight ends that can be top 2 on their team in targets. I would be very surprised if Kyle Pitts was not top 2 in Atlanta in targets this year. He had 90 targets last year, Billy. You don't need to get that much more than that at the tight end position to smash. Talk about your expectations for Kyle Pitts.
Yeah, I think the most important discussing point is the major upgrade at quarterback with Kirk Cousins. That's just kind of the obvious discussion here. But the other part, like you mentioned with Jonnu Smith is gone. And that opens up 81 targets at the tight end position alone, which is 46.8% of the available targets, which are 190 in this Atlanta Falcons offense, which gets them inside of the top 6 for total available targets in the league. So there's a quarterback upgrade. There is a, less competition at the position alone for him at the tight end. We know that Ding Dong Arthur Smith is gone. And so there is, I say, a lot of reasons to like Kyle Pitts. Everybody in the chat who's been burned by him year after year after year. This is the meme. Right when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. Right, Theo? Are you back in?
Oh, yeah. I'm completely back in. And Billy, one other thing that's interesting about Kyle Pitts is younger than Trey McBride, younger than Dalton Kincaid. Like, Kyle Pitts is still only 23 years old. It seems like he's been in the league forever. But he'll be 23 years old to actually start the NFL season. I mean, Billy, this is the 4th overall pick in 2021. This could be like the redemption song season for Kyle Pitts, where he actually has a big-time season. We talked about 2021, 110 targets in 2021. And also you talk about the fact that TJ Hawkinson had such immense success last year with Kirk Cousins. Those first 8 games of the year, TJ Hawkinson was averaging over 14 points per game in PPR at the tight end spot, which was right at the top with Travis Kelce. So Cousins, the splits that Hawkinson had with Cousins behind center, like I feel really, really good about this one.
I'm going to say it, Theo, 1,000 yards this year for Pitts.
1,000 yards, and it's happened before. Billy Muzio, you're not having to go out on a, not having to like say, something that's never happened. You saw this in 2021. And also, like, who did he have a quarterback in 2021? Matt Ryan, a normal NFL quarterback who could get talented players the ball. He's had such bad quarterback play. Like, Pitts getting 90 targets last year, he only had 53 receptions. That's ugly. That's really, really ugly. So this was awesome, Billy. I'm really happy we're back to grinding here on First Class Fantasy. We're going to bring you awesome shows like this every single week. Just to recap our Bounceback candidates: Pat Freiermuth at 5, Kyler Murray at 4, Devonta Smith at 3, Patrick Mahomes at 2, and Kyle Pitts at number 1. Billy, let everybody know where they can find your work.
Here at Player Profiler. I'm back, baby. I'm here. We're recording every Thursday now on First Class Fantasy, jumping back in the ranking scene. I'm going to get some things cleaned up. Dario's been filling in for me, and so I'm going to start attacking the sheets here and starting to get some updates going. So I'm officially back inside of the content creation side of things. And again, as always, we're going to be launching that new thing shortly. Keep your eyes and ears peeled. A couple weeks away. And so I'm excited, Theo. I'm excited to be back, excited to be recording again, excited to talk some football.
We're going to have a huge summer here at Player Profiler. I'm going to drop a press coverage with Andrew Erickson of Fantasy Pros on Friday. And then Davis Maddock is joining me on Dynasty Life. That show is probably going to drop on Saturday. Stick with us here at Player Profiler for all of your podcasts, all of your YouTube content. And make sure you're subscribing to our podcast. And if you're enjoying watching this on YouTube, give us a like, and also make sure you're hitting that subscribe button. We'll see you next week.
From the Podfather to you, I deeply appreciate you tuning in. And many ask, what can I do? What can I do to help support the hosts, the research they do, the production costs? Go to playerprofiler.com, Dynasty Deluxe, World Famous Draft Kit, Rankings, DFS Dominator, and of course, data analysis. Subscribe to any one of those, and you support all of us and take Player Profiler to the moon.